The verse, loved ones, is Ephesians 5 and 21. And we did deal with it before, but I do think there are more things to see in it. Ephesians 5 and 21. And it is, of course, really about the body and how the body relate to itself. Ephesians 5 and 21, page 1020. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. I often read some of the commentaries to you because I feel, well, at least you'll get it clear from somebody else, even if I mess it up. So that's why at times I read you the commentaries, because sometimes they put things better than I do and say it more clearly, and sometimes just give an environment, a context to it. Submitting yourselves one to another, maintaining due subordination in the various relations of life. And then he goes on to say that this is the general principle of religion that the apostle is about to apply to, of course, wives and husbands and all that kind of thing. But then he says at the end, the general meaning here is that Christianity does not break up the relations of life and produce disorder, lawlessness, and insubordination, but that it will confirm every proper authority and make every just yoke lighter. And then I thought it was an interesting, I don't know what made him make the statement, but I thought there was something to be examined in it. He says, infidelity is always disorganizing. Christianity never. Infidelity is always disorganizing. And it does seem, you know, a man like Mr. Donahue would certainly say, yeah, it's disorganizing when Bell ceases to have the sense of loyalty to me that I have to Bell. And you can see how many of the old attitudes that were based on God's faithfulness, such as the loyalty of men to their firm and the firm to the men, that is disorganizing when that breaks up. And infidelity is disorganizing, you know. It brings disorder to a world. Then I think as Robertson says, submitting yourselves to one another, let no man be so tenacious of his own will or his own opinion in matters indifferent as to disturb the peace of the church. Now that ties up, you remember, with Augustine, and in things essential unity, in things that are not essential, you know, charity. But nobody should be so tenacious of his own will that he breaks things up. In all such matters, give way to each other and let love rule. And that's what I tried to share from my own heart some days ago, you know. You never lose by letting God have his way. And his way for you is the way that is working at that moment. Whether we think it is his will or not, it's plainly his will because he's allowed it to happen. And our place is to rejoice in it. Then he says, in the fear of God, setting him always before your eyes. That is, when you submit to another person in the body, you do it as unto Christ. You do it for Christ's sake. Setting him always before your eyes, and considering that he has commanded you to love one another and to bear each other's burdens, and that what you do in this way or any other commanded case, you do as unto the Lord. And it ties up, you remember what Jesus says, if you give a cup of water to one of the least of these, my brethren, you do it unto me. And that's what this verse is saying, be subject to one another out of, actually, some of the old manuscripts say out of the fear of God, and some of them do say Phabu Christou, out of respect for Christ. So of course I think that's our translation, probably, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. It is out of reverence for Christ. We're doing it as unto Jesus. You say, that person isn't worth respecting. That's not the issue. They are part of Jesus. And when you respect them, you do it unto Jesus. And that's why you respect them. You don't respect them because they're more brilliant than you, or cleverer, or they're your boss, but out of respect for the one of whom they are a part, out of respect for Jesus. Then subjecting, yes, in the fear of God, yes, and that's what he says. Fawcett, the commentator, points out that, oh, well, I'll read it because he says, the believer in the fear of God, he says, Aleph, A, B, if you know the manuscripts, A is Sinaiticus, B is Vaticanus, you know. In the fear of God, Aleph, A, B, Vulgate, read, in the fear of Christ. The believer passes from under bondage to the law as a letter to be the servant of Christ, which through instinctive love to him is really to be the Lord's free man, for he is under the law to Christ. Christ, not the Father, is to be our judge. Thus reverential fear of displeasing him. I always thought that, you know, isn't there fear besides fear of the person beating you over the head? Surely there's fear that you might offend them, or that you might displease him. And thus reverential fear of displeasing him is the motive for discharging relative duties as Christians. So those are some of the things. I thought that there were various ones. Thought one of them was ministry. We're all part of the ministry, but God gives to some of us, or we agree really, that it seems right before God that Marty should do the library, you know, that somebody else should head us up in the emailing, that somebody else should head us up in something different. Even for us, really, Colleen and Martha are in the same boat, even though it's business. For us, we have various people that we feel should lead us out in those things. And I would remind you that being subject to them and listening to them is something that we do as unto Christ. And then that's what enables us to achieve things. I think part of the difficulty that some even newsletter would face is they would lead, but we would not follow. And I think that's true. I think we'd all probably say, yes, that we certainly did some of that. And that's what this verse is talking about. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. If Marty is given responsibility for the library, then we listen to what he suggests and we do our very best to work with it. So constantly you're thinking, now this is Christ. This is another part of Christ that is saying I should do this. That's how I should refer to it. That clears you from the sneaking work of deceptive spirits that says, that person does not do this herself, or that person does not do this himself. Why should I submit to him? Because he is speaking as Christ, on behalf of Christ to you, because he is Christ. So you're obeying Christ through him. What is the effect of it? You don't need me to tell you. Builds the other person up tremendously. I mean, they might even begin to think that you're dumb if you do what I tell you, when I see how I fail in my own life. But it's uplifting to her. It lifts them up. It sees them by faith in faith by what they are in Christ. And it lifts them up. It strengthens that leader. You always strengthen the leader every time you submit to them. And whoever happens to be the leader in that situation, you strengthen them. You say, well, somebody should tell them what to do, or somebody should tell her to get on with it. No, you just obey and submit and pray for the person, and you'll see them growing strong. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's opposite to the world's way. It's completely opposite to the world's way. It's the way of love. And of course, above everything else, it's the way of keeping our own souls safe, because we don't get into the judgmental business, and we don't get into the managing business, where we start managing what we're doing in the newsletter or what we're doing in something else. But we do what God has guided us to do through the person who is responsible for that particular ministry. So it's an interesting way of operating, you know. And I'm quite sure the world's companies will eventually discover it's the only way to operate. But of course they have to run out of all their own methods. But we, above all, need to take advantage of the good word that God has given us. Be subject to one another, not necessarily because you think that person is wonderful, not necessarily because you think they're brilliant or better than you, not necessarily because you'll get into trouble if you don't, but out of reverence for Christ, doing it as unto Jesus. So it seems to me that's one obvious place, you know, where our ministry is divided up among all of us, and different ones of us have different responsibilities. Similarly, of course, it speaks to you when you're put in charge of something. It is Christ that has allowed you to come into that position. And as you fulfill your responsibilities there, so your life in Christ will be stronger and will be healthier. So it is all to do with Jesus. That's one obvious place. Gifts. Seems to me there are different ones of us have different gifts. It's obvious that Joanne has, you know, a couple of gifts at least that are good, and she has music as one of them. And Greg has music, and all of us have different abilities we have, and Marty Overby has certain abilities that the others of us haven't got. Martha has certain. So God gives every one of us different gifts, and it's as the hymn said, you remember, help us to improve each other's gift. That's what we've to do. We've to help each other to improve the gift that we have been given. And we do that mostly, of course, by respecting it, encouraging the other person to see they have received a gift. And of course that works wonders for a person who thinks, I'm a nothing, I have no gifts at all. You know, oh, I wish I could sing, I wish I could play the organ, as many people here do, but I wish I could do this and that. It does wonders for a person who feels in that position. And so we're asked to submit to one another who, according to the gifts that God has given us. Where somebody is good at something, let them do it. I really you look back, 210, you know, I've been at it 40 years now. I'm 50 years in the ministry, but I'm 40 years preaching. And you tend to look back, you know, and I think of the numerous occasions on which the dear big Kansas farmer probably could have handled the thing very well without me. But I would come visiting, of course, as you know, and we would be doing something like putting up the sheetrock on the ceiling of the bedroom down there. We'd be doing something, and of course I was boss back there. I'd naturally sweep in, and in fact I'd think of it to myself, yeah, well, I ought to do it. And dear love him, he was so loving and so submissive to me that of course he then toned down and let me go, and I ran the thing, you know, for a number of years until I began to realize he does know a little more about the thing now than I do. But it seems to me there is a loving submission to one another in regard to gifts. And the more it takes place, the stronger the gift becomes, and the wiser and more Christ-like becomes the use of the gift by the person. So we do have gifts. And it is important to respect each other's gifts. And the gifts, please stop the practice of trying to identify your gift. You have a gift. God has given you some abilities and some attitudes and some ways of thinking that nobody else has. And God has given you certain gifts that you ought to use. And we ought to respect you for them. So that's important, you know. And it's important, as my little illustration of Marilyn and me go, it's important then to see who has the gift for this or that, so that two of you are not scrambling with it. And if somebody has a gift, you go with it, and you keep quiet, you know. So I can see gifts. I can see it in wisdom, you know. We all have different insights. That certainly come home to me very strongly. IQ is not brilliance at everything. there may be something called IQ, though I frankly think everybody, all the psychologists and psychiatrists are becoming very skeptical about establishing IQ. And Minnesota Multiphasic and all the ridiculous tests that we had are really not in the place of respect that they used to be. And so I think it is quite questionable how valuable it is to establish a person's IQ by this test or this battery of tests or that. I think maybe what you're doing is finding out who can do the test best rather than what their IQ is. But it's important for us to see that in the realm of Jesus there is wisdom. Marty has a little note which I enjoyed on my birthday card, you know, and I'm forgetting, but it certainly reminded me that my hair was like his wife's, and I think it went something like full of light. Full of light. I got the full of light because that's quite nice, you know. But anyway, we all have different light about things, and it's very important, it seems to me, to recognize that when it comes to us. And sometimes you'll be talking to somebody about something and you'll think, well, they don't even understand this as well as I do. And they'll say something, rather Jesus will say something through them. It'll light up in your mind and you're a fool if you ignore it, you know. Look for light. Always look for light from the simplest person in the world. Look for light, you know. Always be on the lookout, because God gives different ones of us light. Some of us do what the poets, we used to say the poets speak better than they know. Some of us do that. Some of us speak better than we know. We say something that we don't understand ourselves, but it is true, and it's light, and it's actually beyond us, but God uses us, as he will use even an ass to speak, so he will use us. And it's important for us to submit to that when it comes. In that way, we're all very precious. In that way, we're all worth listening to. We're all worth listening. You miss a world of joy, delight, and life if you mark this person off, you know. Well, if we're talking about that, they don't know anything about that, so I can block them out. This guy, he knows a lot about this, so we'll listen to him. Do that, and you can miss light that God has for you. Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ, that he has given different light to all of us and different wisdom to all of us, and often it will come from the unlikeliest person. So I can see the whole business of light. I can see it in conversation. If you're a monologue person like me or like Greg Lightshoe, then you know how conversation can go or wither, shrivel. He can either get into complications about a certain camera or electronics, or I can get into an exciting philosophical point that I think ought to be, I was going to say exterminated, but ought to be explained. And
same use of the word.
I know it. That's why I said it. I thought, isn't a bad idea. But it seems to me that the monologue people like Greg and myself, well, you know, it's obviously bad. I mean, and he knows it too, and I know it. It's bad manners, for one thing, you know, because even if you can't see the other person's eyes glazing over, you suspect, yeah, maybe it is right. Maybe the idea of conversation is table tennis. That's really it, you know, it's ping, pong, ping, pong. I ping to you and you pong to me. I throw something to you and you throw a sentence back. That's conversation, you know. Conversari, versari in Latin is to turn. Con is to turn with or to turn against, but it does mean that you take turns. That's the big thing. And it seems to me in conversation that's more and more important now. Haldeman, who was the guy, of course, that started stonewalling, and stonewalling meant in Nixon days that Haldeman got up and simply said, no, we don't know. No, that's not so. We all knew it was so, but he just said, no, it's not so. And so the whole Nixon administration took on the practice of stonewalling. A stone wall is something you can't, you know, it's like a brick wall. You can't get through it. It won't move. And they just stonewalled. They just said it. We knew it was untrue. It was George Bush. That's what killed us continually, you know. He said what we knew wasn't true, but he kept on saying it. And the administration kept on saying it. And the newspapers kept on saying it. And that's where we all began to feel this thing is going bonkers. Because we knew it wasn't true, but they just kept on saying it, until it has become a habit of our society. It is. You in America are lucky that you don't have to look at some of the business programs we have to look at.
UK.
But I'm sorry, you in the UK are lucky that you don't have to look at some of the business programs we look at in the US. We have several guys that they just talk, and they keep on talking against you. And another person replies, and they just keep on going. They keep on talking. They overwhelm you with just talking what they're saying. And they don't listen to you at all. They just talk against each other. We at times shut the program off. It is so upsetting. Because 3 or 4 of them are talking against each other. And yes, that's becoming the habit. It's exciting, you see. Television is after excitement. And it's exciting to have people just talking against each other, not listening to each other, just talking against each other to overwhelm each other. So actually the people that win are the people that can talk longest and loudest. And that often happens. And that has, of course, become our society. That's what happens now in our society. I caught it at times with, of all people, Marty Overby, you know, but I think we all can fall into it. It's tiring, it's wearisome. I eventually just give up, you know. That's what I decide. I just say, okay, just let the other person talk. That's not my opinion, but I'm not being given a chance to express my opinion, so that's it. Now, what that does is, of course it's unloving and it doesn't spread love, it spreads frustration, but as well as that, you lose the fun of each other's company. You lose the enjoyment of each other's company. It's quite enjoyable to sit at the table, and I don't know that there's anyone here who has not experienced this. It's quite enjoyable to sit at the table, and if somebody notices that you're being left out of a conversation, or nobody's talking to you, or you're sitting at the end, or something like that, it's really enjoyable if somebody, you often feel in pity for you, but you appreciate it so much. They direct something towards you so that you can respond. And I know we would think, oh, that doesn't happen in a family as close as ours, but I think it does. And I think the beautiful thing about conversation is you think, is that person enjoying this? Is that person having a nice breakfast? Is that person happy with this? Are they interested in it? I wonder, do they want to talk about what they would like to talk about? That's it. You know, where your eyes are out looking for anybody to whom you can express some love. And that is being subject to one another. So being subject to one another in conversation is a way of expressing love to each other, and of course a way of getting to truth, because it stands to reason a few of us don't have all the truth. And often it's not necessarily the person who is fluent with the language that has all the truth. Often the person fluent with language actually covers over the truth. And the person who stumbles a little in their phraseology can often say things that are deeply insightful. So I can see in conversation there's a place for being subject to one another, again, out of reverence for Christ. And I'd have to say that many of you, I mean, it's improved tremendously over the years, and many of you are very loving in that way, certainly to me, and I think often to each other. But I do think that it's something to remember, that it's, yes, we monologuers are wrong. We shouldn't go on, and Greg shouldn't go on, and I shouldn't go on, boring you with my views of philosophy or his views of electronics. We should give you 2 or 3 sentences, let you absorb that lot, and see what you do with it. And then if you come back, at least that's what I try to do. If the person comes back with something that shows they do understand what I said, or they are interested in it, then you can go on, you know. But if they come back with some comment that is just a cliche, then you try to get on to another subject. But conversation is an art, and it is a way of expressing love to each other. And above all, it's a way of finding more truth yourself, you know. So I can see that being subject to one another in that way. In life itself, in life's behavior, of course, you know, in the way we behave, the way we run our lives, the way we spend our time, all of that, we can be subject to one another, or we can just bull ahead, you know, with what we want. And I think we all are aware of that, you know. Should you run your life by what other people want? No. You should run your life according to what Jesus wants. But he did spend a lot of time with people who needed help. You know. He did spend you never thought of him as thinking, what did he want to do? You always thought, when he looked at Mary, or when he looked at Peter, he was always thinking, what can I do for them? You know? So no, I don't think you run your life according to what other people want, but it does seem to me that people are important in our lives, and our attitude to each other is an expression of our attitude to Jesus. And so I think it should figure a lot. It's quite interesting. Always, there are many things that idiots like myself have to learn. But of course, when you felt called to the ministry, you felt your life was no longer your own. That's good in some ways and bad in other ways. And my poor wife suffers some of the bad, you know, because it can easily be the plumber looking after everybody's pipes but his own, and that's not right. So I'm not suggesting that you ignore your own concerns, but it seems to me safer to think of yourself as called to live for the benefit of your brothers and sisters, and therefore of Jesus. And generally, it's better to think of your life in those terms, or it's safer. But I certainly agree with you that God alone can show you what that means for you. But I can see that being subject to one another in our ordinary everyday behavior is something that is very real. And one certainly ought always to think, now, why am I doing this? And is it something that is good, that God wants me to do, or is it a time when I could be doing something for somebody else? So I think that's part of it. So what we need to do is ask God to give us light on these things, you know. Lord, can you show us how to be subject to one another in a way that builds each other up and convinces us that we are part of you and that you can do something through us that you can't do through anybody else. What can I do to build up that conviction in my brothers and sisters and in myself? God will give us light. Let us pray.